Passing the absolute power of an entire empire to an infant simply because of who their father is seems entirely irrational. Logic suggests that granting the throne to the strongest, most capable warrior would be a much better system. The Roman Empire actually tried that alternative. By the 3rd century, the ancient families of Rome had largely died out or been purged by previous tyrants. Nobody could claim the throne strictly by birthright. The door was left wide open for anyone to assume supreme power, provided they had the ambition and the sheer merit to take it. The problem is, in a sprawling society without a strict legal rule of succession, there is really only one group unified and powerful enough to enforce their collective will on everyone else: the army. When civil law steps aside and political power becomes a prize awarded purely on capability, the military naturally becomes the sole judge of who wins, and they rarely choose scholars. Enter Maximin. Born to a Goth father and a Milani mother, he was a Thracian peasant of gigantic stature. He started out as a wrestler and fought his way up the ranks through sheer physical dominance and ruthless discipline to become a high-ranking military commander. At the time, the reigning emperor was Alexander Severus. Alexander was cultured, refined, and peaceful, but to the battle-hardened legions shivering on the frontier, he looked like a weak civilian who took his orders from his mother and the Senate. The troops were tired of taking orders from a polite administrator. While assembled on the banks of the Rhine, the army mutinied, murdered Alexander Severus, and raised Maximin to the purple. The moment the legions placed a peasant brawler on the throne, they stripped away the Senate's long-held illusion of control. The Roman military realized that they alone were the state. Maximin's reign was immediately defined by a profound class insecurity. He knew perfectly well that his barbarian origins, lack of education, and savage appearance drew the quiet contempt of the Roman elite. To compensate, he turned to terror. If he suspected anyone of whispering about his low birth, the response was immediate. Without a witness or a trial, Maximin slaughtered thousands of wealthy nobles, senators, and even the very friends who had helped him rise from poverty. For 3 years, he completely ignored the civil government. He refused to even visit Rome. The capital of the empire was effectively reduced to wherever Maximin pitched his military camp along the Rhine or the Danube. For a while, the common people watched the elite suffer with relative indifference, but Maximin had an enormous, greedy army to pay, and to keep his only constituency happy, he eventually had to look beyond the pockets of the senators. When a ruler relies exclusively on the military to hold power, he is inevitably forced to turn his own empire into a conquered territory, draining its wealth to feed his soldiers. Maximin went after public property. He confiscated the independent revenues of Roman cities, stripped temples of their gold, and melted down the statues of gods and heroes to stamp into currency like this to hand out to his troops. The empire reached a breaking point in the province of Africa. A corrupt imperial official pushed a group of wealthy youths into a corner with an unjust financial ruling. Facing total ruin, they armed their slaves with axes and clubs and stabbed the official to death. Knowing Maximin would execute them all, the rebels seized the wealthy town of Thystris. Desperate for legitimacy, they forced their local governor, an 80-year-old intellectual named Gordian, to accept the title of emperor. When the letters from Africa reached Rome, the terrified Senate saw an exit. They eagerly embraced the rebellion, officially ratified Gordian and his son as co-emperors, and declared Maximin a public enemy. The conflict pitted the wealthy, educated remnants of civil society directly against the brutal reality of an extractive military dictatorship. The problem with a rebellion built on intellectual ideals is that it still has to survive on a physical battlefield. A small band of hardened veterans loyal to Maximin immediately marched on the rebel capital of Carthage. The civilian uprising was utterly destroyed. The younger Gordian was killed in the fighting, and upon hearing the news, his elderly father took his own life. Their reign lasted exactly 36 days. The rebels had fielded a massive crowd, but it was an undisciplined multitude raised in peaceful luxury. Against the cold, professional violence of Roman legionaries, their numbers meant absolutely nothing. You can have moral high ground, the enthusiastic support of the public, and legal backing of the Senate. None of it holds any weight if you lack the hard, physical leverage to enforce it. When the news of the Gordian slaughter reached Rome, the Senate was gripped by absolute terror. Maximin was now marching toward Italy with the full destructive force of the imperial army, out for blood. Trapped and desperate, the Senate took an unprecedented step. They elected two of their most capable members, Maximus and Balbinus, as co-emperors, tasking them with raising a militia to fight a total civil war. Which brings us back to the absurdity of passing an empire to a child. The bloody chaos of Maximin's rise, where the crown was awarded purely to the strongest man in the room, demonstrates exactly why arbitrary traditional rules of succession were invented. Without an unassailable legal framework to transfer power, society violently defaults to the rule of the strongest. And when the sword alone legitimizes authority, it is only a matter of time before a nation's military turns those weapons against its own people.
There is a terrifying moment in the life cycle of any republic. It happens when the men carrying the weapons look around and realize they hold all the actual physical power. In 235 AD, that realization took the form of Maximin. He was a massive barbarian soldier who rose from the lowest ranks of the army and seized the highest office in the Western world through sheer brute force. Maximin didn't bother with the Senate. He bypassed the laws of Rome entirely, ruling directly from his military camp and leaning completely on the loyalty of his veteran legions to enforce his will. But he spent his reign far from the capital, waging campaigns against the Germans and Sarmatians along the Danube. That physical absence left a slight opening back in Italy. The highest office in civilization had been hijacked by a warlord. The politicians now had to figure out if civil law could ever force a heavily armed military back into its box. The Senate struck back. Desperate to restore constitutional order, they held an election and elevated two of their most distinguished politicians to the throne, Maximus and Balbinus. They were a carefully balanced ticket. Balbinus was an affluent magistrate who excelled at civil administration, while Maximus provided the edge as a strict military disciplinarian. Almost immediately, a riotous Roman mob forced a compromise. To appease the streets, the two senators had to adopt a 13-year-old boy named Gordian III as their Caesar, the only survivor of a noble family that had already died trying to revolt against the tyrant. The board was set. You had patricians trying to legislate their way out of a crisis from the halls of Rome, while a giant warlord marched toward Italy with an army of hardened veterans. The Senate played a brilliant defensive hand. They ordered a scorched earth retreat across the Italian frontiers, moving all the food and livestock behind city walls to starve the advancing invaders. Maximin's army hit a brick wall at the city of Aquileia. The river was swollen with freezing meltwater, and the fortified city easily repulsed their attacks with showers of artificial fire. Stranded outside the walls, Maximin's soldiers began to freeze and starve. In that misery, the troops recognized a hard truth. Their commander was entirely dependent on their muscle to survive. Fearing for their own families, a faction of Maximin's own guards walked into his tent and slaughtered him and his son. The Senate celebrated this as a victory for the Republic. In reality, the siege taught the legions an incredibly dangerous lesson. They held the ultimate authority to execute their own rulers the moment they became an inconvenience. Back in Rome, the Senate's victorious emperors immediately began to unravel. Confined to the palace, Maximus and Balbinus fell into a bitter, silent feud, driven by mutual jealousy over their differing backgrounds. While bickering, they alienated the Praetorian Guard. These were the elite troops stationed right inside the capital, and they despised taking orders from civilian politicians. The guards ran the math. If these politicians successfully consolidated power, the military would lose its leverage. They would face a slow, steady purge disguised as public discipline. So the Praetorians stormed the palace. They found the two emperors, stripped them of their robes, dragged them naked through the streets of Rome, and hacked them to death. The Praetorians had exercised a violent veto. They proved senatorial decrees were worthless if the men holding the weapons chose to ignore them. With the older emperors dead, The 13-year-old Gordian III was thrust onto the throne as the sole ruler. He was effectively a hostage, propped up entirely by the whims of the Praetorian Guards, who just murdered his colleagues. Gordian got a brief reprieve when a brilliant minister named Maximinus took over the administration. Maximinus managed the army and pushed the invading Persians out of Mesopotamia, only to die under highly suspicious circumstances. His replacement at the head of the guard was Philip the Arab. Philip was a ruthless opportunist with zero intention of serving a teenage politician. Far out on the eastern frontier, along the Euphrates, Philip sabotaged the supply lines. He intentionally starved his own troops to manufacture a crisis, blaming the resulting famine on the young emperor's incompetence. The hungry soldiers mutinied and executed Gordian. By elevating Philip, the military won again, but they had trapped themselves in a loop. Any leader they raised up was now vulnerable to the exact same manufactured betrayal. In a single season, 6 Roman princes and emperors were cut down: the 2 Gordians, the giant Maximin, his son, and the 2 senators in Rome. This rapid body count stripped away the fiction that Rome was still a constitutional state governed by civil law. Looking back at this era, the historian Montesquieu argued that Rome had evolved into an irregular republic, an aristocracy where the true citizens were the militant men. Under this lens, the military mutinies weren't breakdowns of the Roman political machine, they were the machine itself. Mutinies were their legislative sessions. The soldiers held their debates in brief, sudden flashes of violence. Executing an emperor was simply the way the legions cast their ballots. When an army realizes it can operate outside the law, the Senate's authority evaporates. The most refined civil government becomes a lethal facade, sustained only as long as the soldiers allow it to exist. In the 1000th year of Roman history, the Campus Martius along the banks of the Tiber River was completely illuminated. For 3 consecutive nights, the state hosted a massive, sprawling celebration of mystic sacrifices and endless music. A chorus of 27 noble youths and 27 virgins sang ancient religious hymns to the gods. Every single detail of these secular games was engineered to project infinite pomp, specifically designed to overwhelm the superstitious minds of the public with a deep, solemn reverence for the state. This map shows the sheer geographic magnitude of the empire at that exact moment. To the common spectator standing in the crowd, their civilization had secured total continental dominance, stretching unbroken from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Tigris River. To the thousands cheering in the streets, Rome appeared utterly invincible and eternal. But this dazzling display of strength was an illusion. The architect of this massive celebration was Emperor Philip. Born an Arab outsider, he was elevated to the throne by the military. Philip didn't throw these games out of civic pride. He needed the ultimate spectacle to distract the public and wash away the memory of the brutal crimes he committed to seize power. While the superstitious masses were easily blinded by the light of 100,000 torches, a small minority of anxious, reflecting observers stood apart. They were calculating the actual health of the state. What they saw was alarming. The physical borders and the outward shape of the institutions looked exactly as they had under Augustus centuries earlier, but the animating vigor that actually made the society function was completely exhausted. When a regime throws an impossibly lavish public party, it rarely means the state is thriving. Often, the government is desperately trying to hide a terminal decline. This timeline visualizes Rome's first millennium in 3 phases. The first 400 years of struggle forged disciplined civic virtues, propelling 300 years of rapid expansion and absolute dominance. Finally, the last 3 centuries of apparent prosperity set off a slow internal rot. The immense wealth generated by their middle era eroded the strict poverty and discipline that made conquests possible. Success essentially guaranteed their decay. The demographic rot was severe. The original 35 tribes of Rome, once a highly engaged body of soldiers, magistrates, and active legislators, had entirely dissolved. They blended into a massive, pacified population of subjects who claimed the title of Romans without carrying any of the responsibility. Generations of heavy taxation and state oppression, combined with endless, docile public entertainments, successfully bred out their independent spirit. This passivity left a power vacuum, immediately filled by mercenary armies. As the only independent men left, these soldiers abused their leverage. Through violent elections, they routinely forced their own commanders, outsiders from the frontiers, onto the throne, holding the republic hostage. A citizenry that refuses to participate in its own governance essentially outsources its security. Eventually, the military realizes it no longer serves the state, it owns it. Back along the Tiber, the chorus of youths continue to sing religious hymns, earnestly praying to the gods for the safety of the rising generation. But a very physical, immediate threat was already closing in. The empire's richest provinces, located along the vast, winding borders of the Rhine and the Danube, lay totally exposed to increasingly ambitious barbarian tribes. Historically, Rome's strength never relied on mountains or rivers to stop invaders. It relied strictly on the severe discipline of its legions. By Philip's reign, that discipline was deeply compromised by the greed and weakness of the emperors themselves. Philip's millennium celebration perfectly captured the Roman reality. The outer shell of the state remained intact and shimmering, while the internal organism was dead. When a society reaches the point where it relies on overwhelming displays of wealth and magnitude to prove its validity, you are not looking at a golden age. You are watching a civilization trying to distract itself from its own collapse.